Welcome, everybody. We've got a great lineup of authors for the Buzz panel today, so we're going to start right off so we don't waste any time. So first up today is Robin Kelley. He is here to talk about Black Body Swing, a historical autopsy from Metropolitan Books, and it's coming September of 2021. Robin, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much. So Black Body Swinging, an American Postmortem, it really explains why 26 million people took to the streets in the middle of a pandemic to protest the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and countless others. And it explains, how we got to this point and where we might be going. And so that moment really forced me to stop what I was doing and try to work on this book. And what I argue is that the thousands of Black people killed by police were casualties of war, a war that had begun with the theft of human beings and land. Sometimes it was a declared war, the war on drugs, the war on crime, the war on terror, the war on subversives. Mostly it went undeclared. The police are trained for combat and tend to see low-income communities of color as potential enemy combatants. So I argue that to fully understand what killed George Floyd, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, and many, many others requires a different kind of autopsy, an historical postmortem that really lays bare the structural conditions responsible for the tendency, especially among Black people, for premature death. Each chapter opens with a dead body whose life and death I reconstruct, along with the life and death of their neighborhoods, the city, the police, the generations who came before them. And to truly understand the cause of death, it means going back decades, even centuries. Now the title, some may recognize the title Black Body Swinging. It's inspired by the lyrics to Strange Fruit by Abel Meeropol, sung by Billie Holiday. In the lyric in particular, blood on the leaves, blood at the root, black body swinging in the southern breeze. Though this is not a book about lynching, to be clear, I trace the deaths and the lives of our most recent casualties to the blood at the root, that is, the racial terror at the base of our system of exploitation and wealth accumulation. The blood at the root is racial capitalism. In other words, it is not only the effects of racist policing, but the extraction of wealth from Black people, displacement, predatory lending, regressive taxation, disproportionate ticketing and fines, disfranchisement, environmental catastrophe, and the long history of looting through terror and government policies that suppressed Black wages, relieved us of property, excluded Black people from better schools and public accommodations, dismantled the welfare state, privatized public schools, hospitals, and other public resources, and funded the massive growth of prisons. These policies, I argue, produce scarcity, poverty, illicit economies, regulated through violence, and environmental and health hazards, which leads to premature death. And in each one of these cases, those were the conditions that made people vulnerable to state violence. At the same time, Black Body Swinging is not a book about death. It is a book about Black life and the struggle to preserve it. It is a history of abolition and an abolitionist history. So swinging, therefore, is not about being, swinging on a noose. It has another meaning. It's expressed beautifully by an organizer in Ferguson, Missouri, named Mama Cat, who during the uprising in 2014 said, quote, "For the ones who have their feet on people's neck, when do you feel like enough is enough? Because you gotta know that when you keep pushing people in a corner, they're gonna come out swinging." Now, had the protesters not come out swinging this spring and summer, had not, blocked traffic, attacked symbols of state violence, stood up to rubber bullets, tear gas, and pepper spray, the Minneapolis City Council would not have backed a proposal to replace the current police force with the more humane and equitable system of public safety. At least that's the plan. And my mayor, Mayor Eric Garcetti, would not have cut LAPD budget by $150 million. What made these protests unique, though, wasn't just the large numbers of white protesters shouting Black Lives Matter, but that millions have actually come out and embrace calls to abolish police and prisons and to shift those resources to housing, universal health care, living wage jobs, universal basic income, green energy, and a system of restorative justice. Demands that were once considered pipe dreams are now seen as viable and even necessary. So the idea of abolition has taken hold in ways that have really disrupted, if not shattered, America's liberal illusions. And this is what I call the third reconstruction, the third reconstruction looks like. Now, while my book traces a longer history of state violence and collective resistance to state violence, I make a very specific argument that the current movement that we're seeing now, which we tend to date back to 2012, to the killing of Trayvon Martin, actually has its roots in the 1990s, in the opposition to Bush and Clinton era neoliberalism, to the war on drugs, to the war on terror, to anti-Black and anti-immigrant racism, to prison expansion, police brutality, gendered and racialized violence against women of color, queer and trans people, and the ongoing struggle for reproductive justice. My research draws on a wide archive, some chapters reaching back to slavery and Reconstruction, others to the rebellions of the 1960s, but the story of the last 3 decades also draws on my personal experiences, having been involved with some of these movements, having known and even taught some of its leaders. After the introduction, I opened with a chapter on Timothy Thomas and the Cincinnati Rebellion in 2001, followed by chapters on Rekia Boyd, killed in Chicago in 2012, Mike Brown in Ferguson, Jonathan Sanders in Mississippi, choked to death by a police officer in 2015 while driving a horse and buggy, Deborah Danner, killed by police in New York in 2016, Breonna Taylor, of course, in Louisville, Dominique Fells in 2020, not killed by police, but we could talk about that, George Floyd in Minneapolis, and Dijon Kizzee here in Los Angeles. In light of the overwhelming backlash, the resurgence of white supremacist violence, and the most recent political developments that are taking place as we're speaking, the final chapter of the book asks the question, where do we go from here? Abolition or fascism? It's a question, version of a question that Dr. King had asked 50 years ago. Now, I didn't write this book to leave that question open and unresolved. As an abolitionist text, I wrote it to be a resource in the struggle to beat back fascism. And in that respect, American postmortem has yet another meaning. By exhuming this history, we can see with greater clarity that in order to achieve real abolition, a genuine transformation of our world, we need to do more than topple monuments and shut down police departments. America as we know it must be laid to rest so a new world could be born. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Robin, thank you very much. It's a book that we are looking forward to next year. Thank you. I wanted to let everybody know too that at the end of all of the presentations, we'll have probably a little bit of time to do some questions through the chat. So if you have something, think about what you might want to ask in that. Next up, Ijeoma Oluo is the New York Times bestselling author of So You Want to Talk About Race? She's here today to talk to us about Mediocre, the dangerous legacy of white male America from Seal Press that is coming to us this December. Take it away.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be talking with you all today about my book, and here it is, Mediocre, the dangerous legacy of white male America. And this book really got its start, I do most of my writing as an essayist, and it really got its start because, from years of hearing the question, why are things the way they are right now? What is it with white men right now? Why are they so angry? What are they afraid of? How did we get here? And my general frustration as someone who has spent a long time studying race and political systems in the United States, with this preoccupation with why now, as if white men just fell from the sky in this form, and this isn't the natural conclusion to a long trail leading towards white male mediocrity and white male violence in America. And so this book is kind of centered around this idea that where we are right now is kind of the final form of what happens when you build a country around an ideal white male who is violent, uncooperative, who can only see his own value based on how much more he has than others. And this is what we get. And what I wanted to do was to show the pathway. I want desperately to break this country, and especially our media and academia, away from looking at individual cases. And I want people to see the patterns and what we actually value as a society. So this book goes over 150 years in history, and it's not, I would say, a straight historical book. What it does is it takes various stories throughout our history from various aspects of this country to show once, over and over again, how this preoccupation with white male power and this preoccupation with white male comfort, with really building this kind of cushion around white men that really disincentivizes innovation, cooperation, or any sort of growth, emotional growth, intellectual growth, sees that all as a threat, how it has harmed us, and not just me as a Black woman, but how it harms white men themselves. And so we look at things like football. And that, to me, this is actually my favorite chapter, is the chapter on football. Looking at the history of football, starting, first as a way for rich white men to try to toughen up their sons to make sure that they could keep violent hold of country they had just conquered, to something now used to subvert labor arguments and to control the bodies of Black men. And so looking at the history of that, looking at women in the workplace, and looking at times when we told women we didn't want them in the workplace, but then we desperately needed them in the workplace, but then we needed them to leave the workplace, and all of the different ways we had manipulated this in a way that really made sure we would never see what women could really give to a workspace. And all these different chapters looking at Buffalo Bill and looking at cowboy mythology, it's looking at tech today. It's just a huge collection of stories that tie together in a theme kind of running through history so that you can see the patterns. And what I want people to see is where in our past we had really been establishing these unhealthy traits, these unhealthy attributes, and making them ideals, and where those patterns continue through today. So when we look at what we see today, as far as housing for Black and brown people across this country, we can see roots in the violent response to the Great Migration of Black people north and west. And we can see these patterns and say, oh, this is where we had an opportunity to do better, where we had an opportunity to grow. And because it threatened the status quo for white men, which wasn't that great, by the way, we turned away from it. Not only did we turn away from it, but we often had this country had a very violent collective response to anything that would threaten the status quo for white men. So this is not a book, while you will see characters in it, people in it from history, it's not a book that really singles out individual people and says, this person, this one white man is the problem, because that to me is what I have found to be one of the main problems with how we talk about this issue today, is people want to say it's this person in office or it's this person in media who's the real issue. What it shows is the system that we've built around white men and around white male mediocrity, and how we all play a part. And some of us play greater parts than others, but really how, even though we say we want something more and we want something better, what we reward as a society is often incredibly harmful and often perpetuates this really violent behavior by white men in America, and these violent systems that really seek to not to protect white men while also really limiting the growth and prosperity that the average white man can have in this country. Of course, along with the extreme limitations it places on populations of color, queer, trans people, women, and it's something that we are all suffering from. So it's an interesting book, and each chapter kind of has a different theme that runs through history. And there are times where I was absolutely shocked writing it. There were times where I was really dismayed writing it. There were times where it was really difficult to write. And there were times where it was almost funny, you know, where things got so absurd, where moments in history where you're like, really, we are this committed to upholding these systems that we would do something so blatantly counterproductive. But it's something that I'm hoping that people will read and say, where do I see myself? Where do I see my family? Where do I see my values in these stories? Where have I wed myself to these harmful systems? And where can I start making different choices? Because that's really what I want people to do. This is not necessarily a book that's going to offer a lot of solutions, but it's the shift in mindset that I think that we need if we're actually going to find solutions. Because I do feel deeply that right now, a lot of what we are saying are solutions are still keeping us wedded to oppressive and exploitative systems that really will continue this pattern of, you know, violent white male ideals that will harm us all. And so what I want people to see is where they have been wed to these systems, even to their own detriment, and really make better choices and start looking at what needs to be dismantled. You know, I do believe that we can do this. And I hope that one of the things that this book lays out is that it was not super geniuses building our systems. It was not, you know, these weren't passed down from on high. These were just people who had money and who had the will and who had power. And we need to harness our collective power. And we already know we can come up with better ideas to really shift, you know, the direction that we're in, and we have to. I was finishing this book up right as the pandemic hit. And I chose to really kind of leave the pandemic out instead of going back and writing in, because it almost felt like the unsaid final chapter of the book where we are right now, in seeing, you know, the mismanagement and seeing what we, you know, the shortcomings that many BIPOC people, you know, women, disabled people, trans people already knew our system had really bear fruit in such a horrifying way. And I want people to understand that it can actually get worse than this if we don't do something now. And I hope that people will use this to really start investigating and, you know, looking internally and make better choices. I also hope this is a book that if you are a BIPOC person reading this, a person of color, a woman, a non-binary person reading this, that it will also show that you aren't unlucky in life. It will help to counter some of the collective gaslighting that our society places on marginalized populations, to say that whatever's happening to them isn't by design, it's bad luck, or they've done something wrong. And to show that this is part of a pattern, and to let people understand that they have every right to demand more, and to demand more from our systems and demand better systems. And I really hope that this will help dispel the idea that what's happening right now, that whatever vulnerable populations are facing is just bad luck, that will help push that away and really help empower us to really listen to ourselves and our gut instincts that are telling us that we can do better and we have to do better. And so that's my book. And I really hope that people enjoy it.
Thank you. Another very important book that we can't wait to have in our stores by the end of the year. So thank you very much for sharing that with us. Next, we have Ehsaneh Sadr. I know I was going to mess up the last name. Sorry about that.
You did great.
She's a social justice advocate with a PhD in international relations, and will be talking to us about A Door Between Us from Blackstone Publishing that just came out this past September. So take it away.
Yep, and I'm actually going to start by trying to share my screen. So hopefully this works well. Okay, and maybe someone can just verbally let me know. Are you seeing?
Yep.
You're perfect. All right,
Yes.
Thank you so much. Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody so much. I'm just so excited to be here. Thank you to CALIBA for all the work that you're doing. Congratulations on your successful merger of North and South. And thank you to all the indie bookstores that are such a force for literacy and love of books in all of our communities. And I want to do a special shout out to my own local bookstore, Books Inc. in Campbell. And one of my absolute proudest, most gratifying moments since my book came out last month was hearing that since I'd made sure that every single one of my friends heard that they should buy it from Books Inc., strong sales of my book actually helped put Books Inc. back in the black after what had been a really tough summer. So it was really amazing and gratifying to feel like my book had a bottom line impact for a store that I care a lot about. So I have this presentation for you, and what I'm hoping I can do is provide a little bit of background, since Iran is kind of a little bit unknown, maybe share a little bit about my connection to Iran, and then a little bit of the historical context of what was going on in Iran in 2009, which is when my book is taking place. So we're going to kind of cover really quickly 1979, 1999, and 2009. Okay. So these are my parents. They met at UCLA. They were students, and politics was a big part of their life from the beginning. They were super involved in the student movement that was organizing against the Iranian king, or the Shah, if you remember. And then even as the family grew, my father in particular was closely following everything that was going on in Iran. And then shortly after this last picture was taken, he just kind of couldn't stand anymore being away from his brothers and his friends and everybody else who were in Iran, out in the streets, risking so much to overthrow the king. So my parents decided that my mom and us kids were going to stay here while he flew to Iran, with the idea that we would join him once things settled down. So my dad left. He was in Iran for a lot of the seminal moments when the king, the Shah, finally left, when Khomeini came and brought what was supposed to be this new and democratic regime. And then we joined shortly thereafter. Whoops, it's not, there we go. And this is a quote from my mom at that time when we came. "I was excited to be in Iran. I felt I was having an experience similar to our founding fathers as they broke away from Britain to establish their own democratic experience." Well, unfortunately, as we all know, Iran's democratic experiment and experience went awry pretty quickly. And by the time I was going into 3rd grade, my parents had had enough and felt they were no longer safe, given the number of friends and family that had been persecuted, people who had been in jail, including my father for a short time. We were lucky enough to be able to get out, and then we moved to be with my grandparents in Salt Lake City. As I was growing up in Salt Lake, and then later we moved to the DC area, it didn't feel safe initially to be able to visit Iran very often. But when I finished my undergraduate degree and was kind of looking for adventure and a way to serve, things had settled down enough that I decided to move back to Iran. This is my cousin and her family that I stayed with when I was in Tehran. And among other things, I was working with the Ministry of Jihad Against Poverty with colleagues that were dedicated to expanding economic opportunity and access in the villages. This is a picture of the ministry in Tehran on the left, and then those are some pictures from some of the villages where I was working. Most of my Iranian family wasn't super religious. They definitely were not regime supporters, but many of my work colleagues were. And so it was fascinating talking with folks about, what it means to support the regime and how they either sort of justified some of the uglier aspects or how their thinking had sort of evolved over time. And then, as it turned out, I ended up meeting and marrying a man whose family was not only from this kind of super conservative grouping, not only just supporters of the regime, but actually had several people who'd held, they were really part of the regime, had held senior positions in the Iranian government. So that was like a whole new level of discussion and conversation. And also experiences, because I became part of a family life that in some ways perhaps felt very different, but in other ways was surprisingly similar to, say, family life in Salt Lake City. So these were some of the things that I was drawing on in thinking about the characters in the books and some of the things that they faced. So now coming to the 2009 election. So in some ways, interestingly enough, it's kind of similar to our own current election. You have an incumbent, Ahmadinejad, on the right, who is running against a challenger, Mousavi, who's on the left with his wife. And Ahmadinejad was definitely kind of the regime-favored candidate. He was one of those folks who would just talk completely off the cuff. He'd say these outrageous things. He didn't care who he offended. Mousavi was a bit of an elder statesman. He was seen by many as favoring more liberal policies, more democratic principles. And one of the things that was unusual about him was the extent to which his wife, Zahra Rahnavard, had a very public persona as well and was quite involved in the campaign. So we were no longer living in Iran at this time, but we did visit quite frequently. And so we were in Iran just a couple of months before the election. This is a picture of me and the kids with my in-laws. I think my husband's taking the picture. And Mousavi's candidacy had generated a lot of enthusiasm. You would see folks sometimes gathering just like totally spontaneously in the streets to shout slogans in favor of Mousavi and against Ahmadinejad. The campaign had adopted green as like their official color, so people would show up with these green balloons and banners all over the place. And then by election day, we were back in California, but we were really excited to see, you know, by all accounts, election turnout was huge. These are pictures of some of the folks who were standing in line for hours to be able to cast their vote. And we were excited because we felt like, okay, this really bodes well for Mousavi, but it was a big shock and maybe more of a shock because we were expecting him to do well, to hear almost immediately after the polls closed that the state-run television had declared that Ahmadinejad was the winner. Mousavi himself did not accept these results. He called for the people's vote to be defended, and over the next few days, millions of Iranians poured in the streets to protest what they believed was a stolen election. The green, the color of Mousavi's campaign, now became the color of protest, and the green movement was born. The cover of my book, it has kind of the green fabric that's draping, and it was inspired by all the green banners and the scarves that brave protesters were using at the time. Of course, it didn't take long before the government crackdown started in a really scary way, and Tehran sort of turned into a battlefield. One of the things that was interesting to me when talking to folks back in Iran, friends and family, were kind of processing what was going on, and I was unable to kind of predict. It was surprising to me who was like in favor of the protests and then who was actually convinced that this was a plot by Western powers to overthrow the government and that the government was doing exactly the right thing. So for the book, I was really interested in capturing this specific moment in time and exploring it through the eyes of families that we in the West don't have to and often don't get to hear from. So this is kind of all the context of what was going on in Iran when the book opens. And it opens on the scene of a wedding between Sarah and Ali. And the wedding was arranged, but the families have had a falling out because of their disagreements over the green movement and the government response. And then in addition to this tension with the family kind of deciding they maybe want to pull this couple apart, Sarah and Ali get actually dragged directly into what's going on in the streets because on their wedding night, they sort of impulsively decide to let a protester into their car to protect her and let her hide from the paramilitary Basijis that are chasing her down. So that's kind of where the story launches off from and then gives an opportunity for folks to kind of get inside of these different families as they're processing and thinking about the events going on in Iran in 2009. So I will stop there.
Okay. Wow, another fascinating story. We have to, and it just came out, so we should have it in our stores and we'll be able to sell that one. That's fascinating. All right, next, Janet Skeslien Charles is the award-winning author of Moonlit in Odessa. She'll be talking about the Paris Library from Atria Books, which will be coming out in February of 2021. Take it away.
Good evening, greetings from Paris. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I'm thrilled to be talking to the California booksellers. In France, we say that booksellers défendre or defend books. And I love that image of defending the work that you love. Many thanks for all that you do for us authors and for the books that we spend years writing. I'm just going to raise my glass to you here and say thank you. I'd like to talk a little bit about my book, The Paris Library. It's World War II, Paris is occupied. There's a war on words. It's Nazis versus American librarians, and the librarians win. The Paris Library tells the true tale of the courageous librarians who defied the Nazis in order to deliver books to Jewish readers. I first learned about this story when I worked at the American Library in Paris as the program's manager. I organized weekly events and learned so much from each writer. It was really wonderful. This year, the library celebrates its centennial. In 1917, when the United States entered World War I, the American Library Association sent 2 million books to soldiers overseas. The Paris Library, as it was called then, was just a depot for books that were being sent to camp libraries and military hospitals. But people in Paris wanted to create an enduring library. Now this library is the largest English language lending library on the European continent, and it represents 60 different nationalities for its membership. In my novel, my character Odile was named after the Parisian bookseller Odile Hellier. At the age of 40, Odile started the Village Voice bookshop on Rue Princesse, where she defended authors and the books she loved for 30 years. In the Paris Library, my character Odile is fictitious, but her colleagues are real. First, I'd like to tell you about my favorite Dorothy reader. I'm just going to show you this picture. That's Dorothy. I found her on eBay. It's very strange to think that our memories are and our histories for sale if we Google obsessively enough. Anyway, after working at the Library of Congress, Dorothy Reader came to Paris alone in 1929. She started in the periodical section at the library and she worked her way up to the role of directress. After the war, she spent 2 years training librarians in Bogota, Colombia. So in the 1940s, she had worked on 3 different continents. She's simply amazing. Second, the head librarian, Boris Nechayev, is from Russia originally. When he was 15, he lied about his age so that he could fight in the Russian Revolution. Later, he and his brother moved to Paris, hoping to find peace, but instead found themselves in the middle of another war. Third, the Countess from Ohio. Claire de Chamberlain, an American who married a French count, was one of the original trustees of the American Library, along with Edith Wharton. During World War II, she was 70 years old, but that did not stop her from dragging a mattress to the library where she slept at night because she was worried about the Nazis coming in. She was right to worry. In the summer of 1939, librarians, like all Parisians, were carrying gas masks with them. To prepare for war at the library, the librarians pasted strips of paper on the windows as protection against shattered glass in case of bombs. The US Embassy had advised all Americans to leave France, but Dorothy Reader and her staff remained. 3 days after war was declared, the directress created the Soldiers' Service. This service sent books to military canteens and to hospitals, but their point of pride was in the care packages that they sent to individual soldiers. From September 1939 to May 1940, the librarians sent 100,000 books to English and French soldiers. The French soldiers sent back a lot of little mementos, paintings, packets of cigarettes. They said they loved National Geographic magazine, and they also wanted to have some young American pen pals if it was possible. That was the drôle de guerre, the strange war, but then the Nazis arrived, and 3 days after the Germans took over Paris, the Nazis invaded the Polish library and stole the entire collection, the books and the archives. A few weeks later, it was the Russian library, and a few weeks after that, it was the Ukrainian library. They even abducted the Ukrainian librarian. So you can see why the staff at the American Library was nervous. Boris, the head librarian, was shot by the Gestapo and taken to be interrogated. Without the quick intervention of the Countess de Chamberlain, Boris would have died. I interviewed his daughter, who was in the next room when he was shot through the lung. Hélène said that Boris made a full recovery. He went on to smoke packs of his beloved Gitan cigarettes every day, and he worked at the library until he retired. Dorothy Reader, Boris Nechayev, and Claire de Chamberlain are the heart, soul, and life of the library, and I hope that you'll enjoy hearing more about them in the book. My novel is set in Paris and in Montana, where I grew up. I lived in Shelby, Montana, population 2,000. My parents were farmers. We were landlocked by wheat fields. But the land was so flat that I could see 100 miles in any direction, and this gave me a sense of unlimited possibilities. In Shelby, our neighbor was Claudine Maynard, a war bride. She was originally from Rouen, and that was not far from the D-Day beaches in Normandy, where she met a GI and married him and returned with him to the States. When Madame Maynard spoke French, when she spoke English, she made it sound beautiful with that beautiful lilting accent. And along with the jigsaw puzzles that featured tulip fields, she was really the only hint we had of the outside world. Spending time with her made me want to come to France. And I came here for 1 year, which a lot of us do, as a teaching assistant in a local high school. I met my husband and decided to stay. In terms of themes in the book, I'm very interested in the shock of cultures, not just French and American, but also between the big city and small towns. My character Odile didn't have an easy time of it in her small town, just like my war bride neighbor, Mrs. Maynard, struggled with homesickness and having to recreate her identity. When I was younger, I was dying to get to the big, noisy city where I could be anonymous and no one would know my business. Now, I miss Montana, the calm, the silence, the quiet beauty, the way people care for each other, exactly for the reasons I wanted to leave. Like my character Lily, who feels like she is living reruns of Little House on the Prairie while the rest of the world gets to watch MTV, I didn't always realize what I had. I wish I'd appreciated things a little bit more. Maybe this year we're seeing things differently. A big part of my book is betrayal. My character Odile betrays the person closest to her. She's good at reading books, but she's not great at reading people, and she needs to find a way to right a wrong. I too betrayed someone by spilling a secret, and I had to think long and hard about how to say I was sorry and how to show I was sorry. In the last few years, I've heard these, "I'm sorry you have a problem," non-apologies. And it makes me sad that we can't admit when we are wrong and ask for forgiveness. Though I apologized and my friend forgave me, I wrote this book to show her I was sorry. This novel is a love letter to libraries and bookstores and to the people who defend books and promote reading. It is a reminder that in the digital age, our libraries, our third space, our sanctuaries, our source of facts in this fake news world are more vital than ever. The Paris Library is a reminder that we must protect what we have. Finally, I'd like to thank everyone at Simon & Schuster for their support and encouragement, and I'd like to thank you all for your attention. I'm really sorry we couldn't meet in person, and I hope someday you'll be able to come to the Paris Library. But until then, I hope you'll check out the novel and that you'll enjoy spending time in the library. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The amazing stories that still need to be told. So thank you for bringing that. It's going to be wonderful. So we look forward to that. Hopefully there's some galleys out there that we can request. So thank you. And last but not least for this session, bringing us home, Andrew Gelwicks is a celebrity fashion stylist and was recently named by Bumble as one of the 100 most inspiring New Yorkers. The book, The Queer Advantage, Conversations with LGBTQ+ leaders on the Power of Identity from Hachette Go, will be out next week. So we can kind of have a launch. We can kind of have a launch party with you from here. So
yes.
Take it away.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you for having me. I'm so honored to be here and speaking with such incredible authors and thought leaders. So before I talk about The Queer Advantage, I want to talk about how it really came to be. And that would start with growing up. I am from Cincinnati, Ohio. I grew up in an extremely conservative suburbia. And at a very young age, I was confronted with the fact that I was different than other people, or told that I was different, rather. And I came to understand that that was because everyone was telling me I was gay. And this was before even I knew what that meant. And people were telling me all these things. And as I got older and I came to understand that might be true, it manifested itself in me into extreme depression and horrible doldrum of suicidal ideation and just severe depression, because I hated the fact that they were right, that I hated the fact that I was gay, and I internalized all of those messages that my peers were telling me at school and that society was telling me, and just I couldn't deal with the fact or accept the fact that this was who I was. And so it got to a point where the suicidal ideation was so intense that I actually had to go to Salt Lake City, Utah, and go into a residential treatment center. To be clear, this was not a conversion center. This was really a therapeutic environment. And I lived there with about 16 other teenage boys, and we were all dealing with our own issues. But it was in that space where I really was learned to confront this and learned how to manage these feelings. And really, I got my life back there. And then, fast forward, I graduate high school, I go to college. I am, I've accepted who I am. And then I get to New York, where I live now. And I am able to work at GQ and Teen Vogue, and am having, the career I've always wanted to have, and getting to work with celebrity styling, and it's everything I could have wanted. And I am realizing through this that I think I really had gotten it all wrong, that throughout the first 20 something years of my life, I had completely misunderstood my queerness and who I was. And that in spite of what everyone had been telling me, that being gay was a weakness and you had to overcome it, I started to think that in fact, being gay and being queer was actually the best thing to have ever happened to me, and that it's this incredible gift that I have, but the gift that I was given. And I was so struck by that, and I really was kind of had to rethink my entire childhood and adolescence, and wondering kind of how this was an advantage and how this was a positive in my life. And I started to want to know, do other people think this? Is this just me? Or is this maybe a common thought? And so I wanted to speak with others, and specifically the most successful leaders in the world. And so that's where the queer advantage comes into play. I set out to interview 51 of the world's most inspiring, successful leaders on how their queer identity has had a positive impact on their careers and lives. So I spoke with leaders from all different ages, backgrounds, races, identities, industries, Barney Frank, Billie Jean King, Michael Kors, Lee Daniels, George Takei, Margaret Cho, Boy George. And despite the incredible differences between all of them, each of these incredible trailblazers is able to uniquely identify how their queerness and their embracing of their full authentic identity has been an asset and has really propelled them and been a tremendous resource and great gift, and not just in their personal lives, but in their professional lives as well. And in talking with them, I was so struck by how multiple people had said to me, Andrew, I get a lot of requests to do interviews about being gay, about being queer. And to be honest, I really say no to them now. I've talked about it. I just want to live my life now. But I'm talking to you because nobody has ever given me the opportunity to speak about the positives. And that's why I want to talk to you and for this book, because that struck me because when I thought about it, I realized that so much of the narrative around queerness or being different is talking about the struggles and the obstacles. And while those are such important conversations that absolutely need to have a platform and need to be heard, that's not the full story. And we don't hear about all the beautiful, incredible, positive things that being queer gives to us. And, you know, if you have those obstacles and struggles, how do you turn those struggles into your strength? And that's really what we discuss in this book. And while, of course, it's talking about queer identities and these leaders all identify as queer, it's really talking about this and celebrating difference and embracing identity and authenticity and, you know, the unique value that being queer is in a world of differences. And I'm so excited. It's coming out a week from yesterday, so Tuesday. And it's really just a book that I hope will not just resonate with queer people, but parents of queer people and allies. And I really hope it's a source of inspiration. I know personally growing up, I would literally sneak into the basement and Google successful gay people because I didn't even know if that was a thing. Like, it was like a mind-boggling concept and only a few people showed up. And so to now to be able to sit down with those people and have these conversations is so exciting. And I want queer people, young queer people who are reading this, as well as their parents, to see all that's in store for them and all the incredible, amazing, exciting, brilliant, fabulous things that arrive when you embrace yourself and you love yourself and you accept your queer, not only accept your queerness, but love it. And so that is the Queer Advantage. And again, I'm so thankful to be here with all of you today. And yeah, thank you so much.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. That must have been really exciting talking to all of those people.
It was a blast.
Yeah, another really important book. So this was an amazing panel of authors.